Good evening. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to St. Jerome's University. Welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Megan Shore, and I'm the director of the center. This year's lecture series is entitled Our Best Kept Secret, Catholic Social Teachings. This title, for those of you who have been here to a number of our lectures so far, I've given this overview, but I'm going to give it again because I know we have some new people here tonight. It comes from the small primer edited by Edward DeBerry and James Hugg that introduces Catholic social teachings, entitled Our Best Kept Secret. Since 1891, with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, the Catholic Church has developed a body of teachings on social, economic, political, and cultural matters. These teachings focus on all human people. These teachings focus on the call for the Catholic Church to uphold the dignity of all human people, to embrace a commitment to justice in the world, and to adopt a preferential option for the poor. In short, they affirm that the Church is required to work for social justice. Indeed, Catholic social teachings calls for a prophetic stand against social and political oppression and corruption. And central to the calling of the Church is Micah's imperative to do justice and walk humbly before God. One of the key principles of Catholic social teachings is the dignity of the human person. This is the belief that human life is sacred, and the dignity of the human person is the starting point for a moral vision for society. This principle is grounded in the idea that all people are made in the image of God, and that all people deserve respect and love. In the 20th century, the dignity of the human person took on a new meaning. Following the Second Vatican Council, new movements began to emerge, which called the Church to rethink what it meant to be fully human. One of these movements focused on the status of women in the world and in the Christian Church. Pioneering theologians such as Rosemary Radford Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza reinvigorated the Catholic Church and the role women play in it. Pope John Paul II affirmed the importance of developing the feminist tradition in his 1995 encyclical, Evangelium Vitae. This encyclical states the tradition depends on them to promote a new feminism which rejects the temptation of imitating models of male domination in order to acknowledge and affirm the true genius of women in every aspect of life of society and overcoming all discrimination, violence, and exploitation. Tonight, Dr. Cyntia Crysdale will speak about the feminist tradition within the Catholic Church. She will deliver the 2006-2007 Teresa Deese Lecture on Risk, Gratitude, and Love, a Christian Feminist Ethic of Risk. The Teresa Deese Lecture is a lecture established at St. Jerome's University by the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Loretto Sisters. The Loretto Sisters is a community of women religious who have been working in Canada since the 1800s. Their mission is to stand in direct way with the powerless, those on the fringes of society. They truly live out the prophetic call to create a more just world that is central to Catholic social teachings. And St. Jerome's University is very pleased with the excellent relationship it enjoys with the Loretto Sisters. And we welcome two of the members of the community here tonight, Sister Doreen Kirby and Sister Carmen Diston. Thank you. Dr. Cyntia Crysdale is an associate professor at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where she has taught since 1989. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from York University and a Master's of Arts in theology from Toronto School of Theology at St. Michael's College. She holds a Ph.D. from the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto as well. She is the author of numerous articles, the editor of the book Lonergan and Feminism, and the author of Embracing Travail, Retrieving a Theology of the Cross. This year, we are privileged to have Dr. Crysdale at St. Jerome's, where she is a resident visiting professor teaching in the Masters of Catholic Thought program here. I welcome Dr. Crysdale here tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. In my experience, a good lecture is usually some combination of some really meaty ideas and a few good stories. So that's what I hope to give you tonight. And if the electronics behaves, you might actually get a few pictures to go with the stories and the heavy ideas. So let me start by telling you a story. I want to tell you about 5 women who in the summer of 1847 left their home in Dublin. They spent 6 weeks traveling through Liverpool to New York and eventually arrived at the Toronto waterfront on September 16th. When they arrived, they had little idea what lay ahead, and they came with no clear directives or plans. One of these women was Teresa Dease, after whom this annual lecture is named. All of the women were members of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and they had come to Toronto to see about the education of Catholic girls. The insecurity of their situation confronted them the minute they arrived. After 6 weeks of grueling travel, there was no one to meet them at the dock. Not knowing what else to do, at the suggestion of their black cab driver, they asked to be taken to the residence of Bishop Michael Power. As Marion Norman tells the story, I quote, "Immediately the circumstance behind this seeming negligence became apparent. The 2 young priests who shared the bishop's living quarters and ministry were still convalescing after a critical illness. The bishop himself, exhausted from his tireless caring for the sick and dying in the fever shed, had already contracted the fatal typhus that, within 2 weeks, would claim his own life. The sisters, faced with this dilemma, were forced immediately to make whatever adaptations the situation demanded. Embarrassed by his failure in hospitality, and fearful lest the newcomers contract the infection, the good bishop at once arranged for temporary accommodation for them through the generosity of a leading Catholic benefactor, Mr. Samuel Goodenough Lynn. By the end of the week, the sisters were settled in a rented house on what is now Adelaide Street East. And within a fortnight, they had begun teaching 9 young Catholic girls. The Loretto sisters, as they came to be called, were following in the footsteps of their foundress, Mary Ward. Mary Ward had stepped outside the bounds of expectation in the early 1600s when she insisted that women religious should be in the streets, working with the needy rather than cloistered behind monastic walls. This active apostolate, along with her insistence that her new institute be headed by a woman, not under ecclesial jurisdiction, meant that the journey towards full recognition by Rome had to wait until after her death. Nevertheless, Mary Ward set an early example by rescuing child prostitutes from the streets of Rome and Naples and teaching them to read. The full history of the Loretto sisters in Toronto cannot be told here. However, one must understand their early work within the context of recently arrived refugees from war-torn Germany and potato-starved Ireland. With very few resources, they managed to set up schools for poor Catholic children, both boys and girls, who otherwise were urchins on the street. One of their schools sat in what is now the parking lot behind Roy Thompson Hall. And the work they began eventually became what we today know as the separate school system of Ontario. In spite of the Victorian mores by which it was unheard of for unattended women to walk the streets in a frontier town known for its drunkenness, rowdiness, and violence, the needs of the children overruled propriety. In addition to poverty and poor resources, the sisters fought for the education of the poor in the face of strong anti-Catholic attitudes. Indeed, the chief superintendent of education for Upper Canada was at that time a man named Egerton Ryerson, whose educational legacy remains. But Egerton Ryerson secretly hoped that the separate schools would die by attrition through lack of resources. The resourcefulness and spunk of these women pioneers is captured by the title of the article telling their story in the Journal of the Canadian Catholic Historical Association. It is entitled, "Making a Path by Walking." Making a path by walking is a good way to describe the ethic of risk that is the subject of my talk tonight. This term, an ethic of risk, was first coined by Sharon Welch in a book written in the late 1980s, recently revised and reissued. There were a few copies at the back, but they've already been sold out. She uses literature of African American women to elucidate the difference between an ethic of control assumed by those with social and economic power and the ethic of risk adopted by those on the margins. Although her original edition used the nuclear arms race as a prime example of the ethic of control, our current situation in the so-called war against terrorism continues to make her distinction relevant. An ethic of control assumes that moral agents can conceive of and execute actions with clear results. There is little room for ambiguity, for this ethic involves, quote, controlling events and receiving a quick and predictable response, end of quote. With a clear plan, a decisive strategy, one is rendered invulnerable to the evil actions of others. This model of moral action relies on the, quote, equation of responsible action and control, the assumption that it is possible to guarantee the efficacy of one's actions, end of quote. It also presumes a monopoly of power, pervasive when one, quote, defines the action as the ability to attain, without substantial modification, desired results, end of quote. Though risk does not go unacknowledged in this perspective, it is merely considered as a variable to be managed. Welch originally developed the notion of an ethic of control in regard to the nuclear arms race before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nevertheless, her words resonate with recent and current actions with regard to the war in Iraq. And let me give you a slightly longer quote here. A factor contributing to distortions in the calculus of risk is the construction of the aim of moral action as the attainment of final, complete victory. The aim of a final defeat of all evil forces, or the aim of finally meeting all human needs, does not appear as anything but praiseworthy on the surface. It is indeed surprising to find that such utopian goals as the defeat of evil and the meeting of all needs can have, and often do have, highly dangerous consequences, and that these constructions make peace less likely and justice seem less likely. This distortion of a seemingly positive goal operates in several ways. One is the inability to accept the prospect of long-term struggle. Seeking utopia, people turn to types of actions that appear to offer immediacy and guarantees, despite the dangers that may accompany these actions. End of quote. Immediately after the September 11, 2001 events, both President Bush and Benjamin Netanyahu spoke of the eradication of evil in terms reflective of this ethic of control. More recently, the rhetoric of staying the course has continued the sense of determination that the original plan will still yield the envisioned outcome. Now, whether the recent elections in the U.S. will change that, we have yet to see. At the same time, it is not only war hawks who approach moral action in this way. Even those within the peace movement and those working in favor of the oppressed in a host of situations can envision themselves on a linear track toward clearly envisioned results. The core of an ethic of control is not the cause being advocated, but the expectation that clear and direct action will eradicate evil. In contrast, the ethic of risk is, quote, responsible action within the limits of bounded power, and involves, again, a quote, persistent defiance and resistance in the face of repeated defeats, end of quote. This ethic attends to that which may yield only partial results. The goal of moral action is not complete success, but the creation of new conditions for the possibility for the future. It is, quote, an ethic that begins with the recognition that we cannot guarantee decisive changes in the near future or even in our lifetime. Further, again a quote, the ethic of risk is propelled by the equally vital recognition that to stop resisting, even when success is unimaginable, is to die, whether that involves physical death or the death of imagination and caring. In such situations, an ethic of risk engages one in a community of risk takers, committed to the struggle over the long haul. It involves strategic risk-taking in the face of overwhelming odds and recognizes the irreparable damage of structural evil. Here's another fairly long quote. The ethic of risk is characterized by three elements, each of which is essential to maintain resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. A redefinition of responsible action, grounding in community, and strategic risk-taking. Responsible action does not mean that certain achievement of desired ends, but the creation of a matrix in which further actions are possible, the creation of the conditions of possibility for desired changes. End of quote. Welch uses novels by African American women to illustrate the struggle, dignity, and defiance characteristic of an ethic of risk. Two books by Mildred Taylor, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and Let the Circle Be Unbroken, tell the story of Cassie Logan, a young black girl coming of age in the racist American South during the Depression. Cassie learns from her family how to have courage in the face of bigotry, even while it is impossible to imagine its eradication. These are wonderful stories. They're actually children's books, but easily read by anyone of any age, and there are a few copies at the back. In contrast, Polly Marshall's novel, The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, depicts Harriet, a rich, white philanthropist who, despite her generosity and goodwill, functions with an ethic of control. While working with the poor on a Caribbean island, Harriet comes upon two starving children in a meager hut. Their parents are off cutting cane, and Harriet cannot bear the suffering of these hungry children. Finding a half-dozen eggs in the hut, and over the loud protests of the children, she breaks and scrambles the eggs over the fire. She is shocked later to discover that the eggs were meant for sale at the local market, that the children had been beaten for allowing her to cook them, and that, in fact, the children had left the cooked eggs untouched. Harriet had assumed that her quick, simple, and direct solution would solve the problem. She is out of touch with the complex systems of family and economic meaning in which she envisions herself acting as an agent of change. Let me read those last two sentences again, and you can insert American military and George Bush and whatever you want. Harriet had assumed that her quick, simple, and direct solution would solve the problem. She is out of touch with the complex systems of family and economic, religious, and tribal meaning in which she envisions herself acting as an agent of change. Thus, an ethic of control assumes that one's moral choices will fix evil in a definitive way. Most often, this solution to whatever problem is at hand involves force, coercion, or violence. It is the preferred modus operandi of oppressors, or more benignly, many of us, many well-intentioned cultural and political groups. In contrast, an ethic of risk recognizes the limits of power, the ambiguity of moral choice, and the partiality of any attempt to eradicate evil. Relying on the solidarity of community over the long haul, an ethic of risk looks more to creating a new matrix of possibilities rather than to finding a single direct solution to evil and its consequences. Welch unpacks the notions of risk and control in light of the exercise of power. Hers is a social analysis that grounds a social ethic. I want to take these categories further to illustrate that, in fact, we necessarily function with an ethic of risk. The world unfolds at both the human and non-human levels according to variables that are not always regular and predictable. Whether we like it or not, we are all subject to risk, and our moral actions always take place within a context of change. So if you don't think you've had enough weighty ideas, you're about to get some more. So fasten your seatbelts and bear with me. We're going to get some good theory here. So let me explain this. This may surprise you, but we're going to talk a little bit about evolution. Let me explain this by talking about evolution and what Bernard Lonergan calls emergent probability. Evolution is about chance. That is to say, after Darwin, we have come to realize that the occurrence of events even and especially the existence of species, is not inevitable. In the world before Darwin, the world of Isaac Newton and his newly found laws of physics, it was presumed that everything occurred according to regularity, governed by laws that can be deciphered and turned into mathematical formulas. The images of dominoes, or atoms if you like, hitting one another in sequence. The cause of events is a matter of ordered action. When A occurs, B follows. Science, in this view, is a matter of gradually discovering the sequence of directly causal events that makes the world function. What is novel about Darwin's origin of species is that it introduced the idea that there is novelty in the unfolding of world process. Not everything was set in order at the beginning. Instead, we now understand that our world has changed over time and that the changes that have come about have been subject to variables that do not operate inevitably, but are chance occurrences. Indeed, there is regularity. All things being equal, objects fall when dropped, and seeds sprout when planted. But in addition to regularity, there is probability, the likelihood of objects falling or seeds sprouting under certain circumstances. So today we have two kinds of scientific endeavors that seek to understand the world in two different ways. Science of the classical kind sets out to understand regularities. By examining in the field or in the lab multiple instances of similar phenomena, the scientist comes up with a law that provides a unified explanation of these events, all things being equal. These explanations abstract from the particular places, times, and many other aspects of the events that verify them. For example, febrile seizures in children are explained by a failure of the brain's electrical signals due to the sudden onset of a high fever. This explanation ignores the color of the clothes a particular child is wearing, whether her hair is in a ponytail, and how tall she is. Most of us are familiar with science of this sort, and we depend on such explanations in both the emergency room and the auto repair shop. But note that such regularities in their explanations include the caveat, all things being equal. In other words, regularities depend on certain conditions being fulfilled. So even our dependence on classical science and the laws it explains recognizes that the regularities in our world are conditioned. That is to say, they are subject to probabilities. Sometimes things line up to occasion regular, expected events, and sometimes they do not. These conditions and whether and when events of a certain kind occur is the work of statistical science. While science of the classical type aims to uncover regularities, statistical scientists seek to understand how often such regularities occur. The statistical scientist is not interested in why a certain event happens, but how often it occurs. Thus, the first and primary thing done in statistical science is to count events of a certain kind under certain conditions. Laws of physics explain why things fall to the ground when they do. But such science does not tell us how likely it is that we will be hit by something falling off the roof of St. Jerome's University when we happen to walk past. In order to know this, we need to count. How often do things fall off the roof? And under what conditions? For example, do things fall off the roof more often when students are in residence? When there has been a heavy snowfall? After a windstorm? On Halloween? So scientists define an event and set a framework in which to count these events. How likely is it that this batter will hit a home run? What is his batting average against this pitcher, against left-handed pitchers, in the postseason, etc.? The point is that we have two ways of understanding the world that correspond to two aspects of world process. There are the regularities that, all things being equal, occur according to universal laws. But there are also probabilities. There are conditions that underlie these regularities and make them possible but not inevitable. Physics explains the laws of motion whereby a ball becomes a home run being hit out of the ballpark. Biology explains the processes of conception when a sperm meets an ovum. Both of these are examples of classical science, but statistical science deals with batting averages and rates of fertility. In other words, how often and under what conditions home runs are likely to be hit and women are likely to get pregnant. The interaction of these two aspects of the world is what Bernard Lonergan calls emergent probability. In order to fully grasp this idea, Stick with me a few more minutes and let me tell you about the notion of a scheme of recurrence. A scheme of recurrence occurs when a series of conditions for an event curl around in a circle, such that event A fulfills the conditions for the occurrence of event B, which in turn fulfills conditions for C to occur, which then satisfies the conditions for A to recur. So presuming you all had a good dinner, there is a very important scheme of recurrence going on in your intestines right now. It's a number of chemical reactions, such that when one chemical reaction occurs, it sets the conditions for the next chemical reaction to occur. And when a whole series of them has been completed, you will feel hunger. And that will hopefully incite you to go get something else to eat, and the whole process will occur over again. Further, there are defensive mechanisms that can develop so that any intervening event that threatens the cycle is offset by a second cycle designed to eliminate the intruder. So if for some reason, unfortunately, you ate some bad food for dinner, some bad mussels or whatever, a different process is going on right now in your intestines, whereby you may end up spending a fair amount of time in the bathroom. And you will, the point will be to eliminate whatever poison you've ingested so that the proper cycle of digestion can once again take place. Okay, note that these schemes of recurrence are conditioned but not inevitable. Thus, though the scheme itself is a combination of classical laws that function with regularity, here's a quote from Lonergan, schemes begin, continue, and cease to function in accord with statistical probabilities. End of quote. Further, not only are there single schemes, there are conditioned series of schemes of recurrence. So it is that the circulation of water over the face of the earth is a condition for the possibility of the nitrogen cycle of plant life to occur. And the nitrogen cycle of plant life is itself a condition for the possibility of the digestive system of animal life to occur. So it is that individual cycles themselves form a conditioned recurrent series of schemes. At any stage in history, then, there are probabilities for the emergence and probabilities for the survival of various schemes of recurrence. The emergence of new schemes depends on a coincidental manifold of underlying events that produce the conditions for such an emergence. But what does any of this have to do with an ethic of risk and an ethic of control? In a world of emergent probability, as I've tried to explain it here, new things emerge because there are underlying conditions that make their emergence possible. If the underlying conditions change, the regularities also have to change. That is what we're seeing with global warming. Indeed, there are those who explain the higher incidence of hurricanes such as Katrina as the function of a shift in underlying meteorological conditions. In our common sense imagination, however, there lingers a kind of mechanistic determinism left over from the era of Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon. In this view, everything occurs according to direct causality, and nothing is left to chance or probability. It is in this view of the world that we succumb to an assumption of the ethic of control. If, as we tend to presume, everything is caused by an A followed by a B, then our actions will issue in clear outcomes. But, as I have been at pains to show, the world is also subject to conditions that shift and change. The point is that to functionally presume an ethic of control is not only morally presumptuous, it's simply wrong. It's just factually incorrect. It's just not how the world works. We may think that action A directly causes consequence B. Sometimes the probabilities are such that this seems to be the case. We may work hard to construe our circumstances so that our actions do have the direct and intended results that we want, but such construal is itself a manipulation of probabilities, designed to reduce the risks that we take in our action. Okay, enough for weighty ideas. Let's get back to telling stories. And I'm going to tell you a story about this little guy, the gray moth. In 1940, the gray moth lived a life of obscurity in the backdrop of human awareness. But in that year, cotton farmers in the U.S. began spraying their fields with a new wonder chemical, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. I want you to know I've been practicing that for a week. Commonly known as DDT. This insecticide was so effective that it left the cotton field standing, quote, virtually vacant, like an archipelago of newborn islands, and out of the woods and hedgerows fluttered Heliothus virensens, the gray moth. Some of these moths, tolerant of DDT, happily laid their eggs in cotton bolls, providing their newborn larvae with a rich diet of cotton. These newborn larvae ate their way through the cotton, belying the newfound solution to pests ruining the cotton harvest. Let me defer to science writer Jonathan Weiner to tell the next part of the story. And this comes from a book called The Beak of the Finch, which is actually about evolution and finches in the Galapagos Islands. But he also talks a lot about pests and other kinds of evolution. And it's just a delightful book to read and has no footnotes. So, and it's also available at the back. Okay, so this is Jonathan Weiner. He says, in the next few optimistic years, pesticide manufacturers assaulted Heliothus with bigger and bigger doses of DDT. They also brought out more poisons from the same chemical family, aldrin and chlordane. The aim was nothing less than the control of nature, and pesticide manufacturers believed that that control was in their grasp. The annual introduction of new pesticides rose from the very first product, DDT, in 1940, to great waves of chemical invention in the 1960s and 70s. In those decades, dozens of new herbicides and insecticides were brought to market each year. Heliothus became one of the most heavily sprayed species in what amounted to a biological world war. Through it all, the moths clung to the cotton in this form. Currently, 2006, after all those pesticides, the little gray moth is throwing the current cotton industry into Louisiana into a panic. It is now resistant to every type of pesticide there is, including the last bastion of pesticides, the pyrethroids. These chemicals, all other things being equal, do in fact kill moths. But if you recall, such regularities exist conditionally. And if the conditions change, the schemes of recurrence change. This is exactly what has happened. In fact, spraying with the pesticides has ironically kick-started all the tried and true processes of evolution. The presence of poison means that the individuals most able to resist the effects of the poison are the ones who survive and reproduce. Eventually, a generation arrives in which everyone is resistant to the pesticide. The underlying conditions of pest life have caused a shift in favor of a new scheme of recurrence, new ways of metabolizing or avoiding the effects of the pesticides. In this way, the invention of pesticides in the 20th century has in fact driven the direction of evolution of the gray moth. And the gray moth is only one of hundreds of insects that have thus adapted. What continues to be ironic, if not amusing, is the fact that chemical manufacturers and farmers continue to think in terms of eradication. In fact, decades of spraying and generations of newer and better pesticides have not altered the percent of harvest lost to pests each year. Again, Jonathan Weiner comments, quote, before humans had heaped up a mountain of pesticides in the 1940s, when we were still in the foothills of this evolutionary adventure, farmers in the United States were losing about 7% of their crops to insects. During the blitz of the 1970s and 1980s, the insects did not lose any ground. Instead, they nearly doubled their share to 13%. 1940, 7% of crops was lost to insects. 13% are now lost to insects. Continuing the quote, indeed, note the ecologist Robert May and Andrew Dobson, the fraction of all crops lost to pests in the United States today has changed little from that in medieval Europe, where it was said that of every 3 grains grown, 1 was lost to pests, leaving 1 for the next year's seed and 1 to eat. End of quote. Closer to home, the antibiotic war on pests in our own bodies tells the same story. The assumption that we could control infectious disease through the miracle of antibiotics has taken the same route as that of the pesticide battles. Hospitals in the Western world began using antibiotics regularly in the 1950s. Today, 1 out of every 3 patients in a Western hospital is on antibiotics, but the resistance to these drugs is keeping pace. The battle against infectious disease has followed the same path as that against the insects. Big companies, big money, and blanket treatment, followed by surprise at failure. In an understated truth, biologist Martin Taylor comments, "It's generally the case that these chemical companies are not familiar with evolution." So E. coli, you've probably seen this critter sometime before. E. coli bacteria follow the same path of the gray moth. If one sets up a colony of E. coli in a petri dish and then blasts it with antibiotics, all but a few bacteria die. However, those that survive have a rare resistance to the drug that has been aimed at them. And in short order, these have once again filled the petri dish. After repeated attempts to eradicate the bacteria in the petri dish, one ends up with a colony in which virtually each member cell is resistant to the predator drug. Like the gray moth and the mosquito and even the ordinary housefly, bacteria and viruses manage to shift the conditions of their survival so that what would otherwise be the obvious outcome of destruction becomes an elusive goal. In fact, it is now the case that the most dangerous place to be in terms of contracting an untreatable infectious disease in a modernized Western country is a hospital. This is where the most sophisticated, most resistant, most elite viruses and bacteria now reside. Harold New of Columbia University insists that it is, quote, critical for doctors, patients, and drug companies to avoid all unnecessary use of antibiotics for humans or for animals, because this selective pressure has been what has brought us to this crisis. Thus, we face the irony, a further quote from Jonathan Weiner, precisely where we wish to control the environment most tightly and possess it most completely, we are powerless to do so, besieged and beleaguered by resistance movements that seem to spring up faster the more we lop them off. The harder we fight these resistance movements, the harder and faster they evolve before our eyes, precisely because it is our effort at control that is driving their evolution. What we call control is to them merely a change in the environment, just another change in an endless series of changes. In sum, the metabolic processes of insects and microbes occur according to direct causality, regular schemes of occurrence that make such life possible. However, these schemes of occurrence, this life, is subject to environmental conditions. When the schemes of occurrence are threatened by environmental factors, the probabilities of survival shift to favor those who have the mechanisms to cope. As these individuals survive and reproduce, the metabolic coping mechanisms become more widespread. Thus, new schemes of occurrence emerge, in turn affecting their ecological systems. Okay, let's get people back in the picture here. What is true of insects, bacteria, and viruses is all the more true of human life, relationships, and behavior. There are regularities, schemes of occurrence, that function according to a series of directly causal events, from individual habits of personal hygiene to the laws and practices governing traffic patterns. Generally, we notice these patterns of recurrent behavior only if they break down, as when we get a toothache or get stranded overnight in an airport. While there may be orderly patterns of human conduct and meaning that perpetuate themselves, these patterns are not inevitable, but depend on the persistence of underlying conditions. As Lonergan puts it, quote, the political machinery of agreement and decision is the permanent yet self-adapting source of an indefinite series of agreements and decisions. Clearly, schemes of recurrence exist and function. No the less clearly, their functioning is not inevitable. A population can decline, dwindle, vanish. A vast technological expansion robbed of its technicians would become a monument more intricate but no more useful than the pyramids. An economy can falter, though resources and capital equipment abound, though skill cries for its opportunity and desire for skill's product, though labor asks for work and industry is eager to employ it. Then one can prime the pumps and make X occur, but because the schemes are not functioning properly, X fails to recur. End of quote. Furthermore, human affairs fall under emergent probability in a distinctive way. Though human schemes emerge and reach a stability whereby they function routinely, as human life develops, less and less importance becomes attached to mere circumstance, and more importance is attached to the operation of human intelligence and choice. The significant probabilities become not those of emerging physical, chemical, biological, or zoological systems, but those of the occurrence of insight, communication, persuasion, consensus, and action. Rather than being merely conditioned by our environments, humans are conditioners of our environments, and hence of ourselves. While this is true of many, if not all, living species, it is true in an unprecedented way of humans, who are not only intelligible but intelligent. That is, we are agents who grasp meaning and transform our worlds through action. So, survival of the fittest, as it operates at the biological level, takes a different turn with human life. Human life is not a matter merely of biological survival and reproduction, but has to do with the meaning and values that we ascribe to our living. The schemes of recurrence that make our lives possible have to do with habits of meaning, regular choices of value, and antecedent willingness to opt for value when value and satisfaction conflict. Survival is about the survival of meaning, of purpose in life, of self-esteem and dignity, of communities of cooperative interaction. Such survival of meaning is dependent, of course, on the material resources that make physical survival possible, but the presence of such material resources is itself dependent on systems of schemes of recurrence that have been created by human industry and intention. Thus, promoting life has to do with promoting the conditions for the possibility of meaning, value, community, loving intersubjectivity. To the degree that egoism, group bias, prejudice, or a quest for mere power distort these underlying conditions to favor some to the exclusion of others, survival of the fittest means that some literally survive at the expense of others. Or perhaps more profoundly, some claim personhood, meaning, and self-value at the expense of others' dignity. So, we come full circle to the question of human action according to control or risk. It turns out, as in Welch's analysis, that the ethic of control is exercised most often by those who pretend to power, who want to believe that they are somehow exempt from the conditional nature of life and its meaning. In large part, the ethic of control is a myth that we tell ourselves, a rhetorical and psychic flourish that protects us from the true ambiguity of choice. It is easier and feels safer to believe that causality is simply a matter of A leading to B. In fact, of course, any action merely sets conditions of possibility for the desired action. Whether such an outcome actually occurs is a matter of probabilities. What we aim to do is heighten the probabilities that the desired transformation will indeed occur. What we need to accept is that there are many variables and many other consequences, perhaps unforeseen, that our action may elicit. Furthermore, and this is the heart of Welch's contribution, those who have more economic, political, and social power are more able to perpetuate this myth for themselves. Indeed, those with such power more often experience the efficacy of their choices and are more often protected from the vicissitudes and vulnerabilities of life. This is why the ethic of risk is a feminist ethic of risk. To the degree that feminism takes as its task the unmasking of dominance, particularly male dominance, it relies on the experiences of women from the underside of history. To the degree that women have found themselves proportionately in social, economic, and political roles that deny them moral agency, they are more aware of the fact that moral choice includes ambiguity, vulnerability, and risk. It is not that women have some essentially different way of making moral decisions by risk rather than control, or that vulnerability in and of itself is a good thing to be sought after. Rather, women and many others who suffer from the powerlessness of social class, race, or sexual orientation are able to be more honest about the risk inherent in all moral choice. Let me conclude then with another story. This was on CBC, both radio and television, back in September. I heard a clip initially on The Current on the radio, but it was also featured on the National in late September. This is like the first Loretto sisters who made away by walking. This is the story of a woman who left home and took one step at a time to make a difference. Nicole Pajot is a woman from Edmonton who in 2004 heard a widow from Rwanda talk about the effects that the 1994 genocide was still having in that country. Moved by this talk, Nicole, single and approaching 60, decided to move to Rwanda to see what she could do. She ended up in Kimironko, a village of 700 women and children who survived the massacre and were scrambling to make a living. These women include Caritas, a 69-year-old grandmother, whose husband and all but one child were killed in the massacre. When she was taken by the Interahamwe herself, she expected to be murdered. But they left her alive, telling her they preferred to let her die of sadness. She now lives in poverty, trying to raise 2 school-aged grandsons. Another younger woman, Jeanette, was 6 months pregnant when the Hutu militia killed her husband and all but one son. 9 men raped her until she fainted and was left for dead in a pile of bodies, including her mother's. She now lives with the AIDS with which these men deliberately infected her, and her daughter, who was subsequently born, also has AIDS. Not only are these women poor, they are traumatized and live lives of isolation and despair. The Rwandan government has set aside a portion of its annual budget to help those recovering from the genocide. However, the entire Rwandan national annual budget is only around $500 million. That's equivalent to what Toronto spends each year on firefighting and garbage collection. The entire national budget is the same as what Toronto spends on firefighting and garbage collection. And only 1% of that is then given to the victims of the genocide. When Nicole arrived, she had several $1,000s that she and a friend had collected in Edmonton. She started by using the money to set up a food bank so that these women would not have to earn money through selling sex or begging. This was a beginning, but Nicole knew that she had to find ways for these women to earn money and to deal with their trauma. A breakthrough came when the women began making crafts with beads, which they sold to Nicole's supporters back in Edmonton and to local tourists. Nicole also found a few sponsors to cover the $100 a year it costs for children to go to school. Gradually, these sponsorships grew so that 25 children now attend school with supplies and uniforms that they otherwise could not have afforded. One of those most important steps came when Nicole invited a nurse to come and talk to the women about trauma. No amount of food or scholarships or money would be able to eradicate the searing memories of the atrocities these women had undergone or had witnessed. The women listened intently to the nurse's presentation. At the end, one woman spoke up and asked, "Is there a cure for this trauma?" The nurse answered, "Yes, there is one and only one. You have to talk about it." Shortly thereafter, a young woman came and asked Nicole if they could have a talk. Florid had been only 12 when the Interahamwe had destroyed her father's house and killed him. She herself fled to the jungle where she hid from the violence. At one point, with youthful bravado, she returned to the place she had loved the most, her school. When she arrived, the teacher asked her why she had come back. Why would she want to learn? When Florid answered that this was her school and this is where she belonged, the teacher mocked her, telling her that there was no point in her learning. She wasn't even a human being. She would no doubt be killed soon anyway, so why bother learning? This was so demeaning to this young, impressionable girl that it seared her imagination. She told Nicole, "I just want to feel like a human being." Eventually, Nicole managed to find some sewing machines for the women. This meant that they could sew uniforms for their children to go to school. They then put in a bid and won a contract to make all the uniforms for students at a local college. In just a few years then, this village has become a haven of women who, out of despair, have found community and dignity. They not only have some income, they have a sense of contributing something, of doing work that is meaningful, of having a future for their children. Nicole Peugeot is not a saint or a heroine. She is simply one woman who, with the help of her friends, made a way by walking. She herself admits that she has not fixed anything. There is no utopian vision here, no surgical strike by which pain and poverty will be eradicated. Instead, Nicole and the widows together have established the conditions for the possibility of change. A food bank, a few sewing machines, crafts with beads, a small charity in Edmonton. All of these shifted the probabilities towards not only survival, but meaningful survival. No one is in control, everyone is taking risks, but the risks make it more likely that these women and their children will both live and die with dignity and a sense of hope. Well, I haven't said anything yet about gratitude or love, nor have I once used the word God. I actually have a lot I could say about any of the above, but rather than launch into another whole lecture, let me just conclude with a few comments. Recognizing that we all live within an ethic of risk is a start, but there are plenty of CEOs and military strategists who are well aware of risks. Indeed, in business, war, agriculture, and medicine, there is plenty of rhetoric about calculated risk-taking. So beyond the mere distinction between an ethic of control and an ethic of risk, there is the question of ownership and hubris. Are the schemes of recurrence that we tinker with our own creations? Are they ours to manipulate for human gain? Just what are the values by which we decide how and which risks to take? If we ourselves and the world we live in are gifts, originating beyond our own creativity and capabilities, then our living with an ethic of risk takes a different turn. An ethic of risk becomes not manipulation, but discernment. We work to place ourselves within the energy of love that is already at work, even in the face of sin and the horrors that evil generates. We seek to be creatures in tune with the Creator, to align our minds and wills with the power of life already at work in the universe. As Christians, we believe that this power has come close at hand through the incarnation of Jesus Christ in history and through the ongoing incarnation of the Spirit in people today. As Christians, we believe that what appears to be an irreversible likelihood that evil triumphs over good at all times has been and can be turned around. The inevitability of death becomes the ground of possibility for new life. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Cynthia. Cynthia will take some questions now. We have microphones on either side of the room, so I invite you to come forward, and if there's people in front of you, just to form a line behind. Thank you.
Well, that was remarkable, the theoretical ways you laid it out, and I kept thinking of stories myself, and especially the project for a new American century, which you would have observed firsthand in Washington, and the people behind it, and the plain old hubris that you talked about there. It's just astounding to me, and it's reaping the whirlwind now. But I'm thinking about the Bible a bit, and how it is, as various people have said, like Mary Ann Tolbert, it's a thing of oppression and liberation. And there's so much of that in the Bible. And feminism has taught us to read the Bible with the hermeneutics of suspicion and so on. And so you have to look very closely for it, because you can read through the book of Kings and Chronicles, and it's slaughters, and it's this avenging, angry God and so on. It's the whole Deuteronomic history and so on. But then there's the Exodus story, and as you point out in your book out there, the cross, which, you don't seek suffering, but you accept it somehow and so on. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that just a bit, because there's so many more dimensions that you weren't able to get into.
First thing that occurs to me is that when you're telling the story in retrospect, it's very easy to talk in terms of, oh, well, we did this and that occurred. I mean, it's when you're telling the story after all the events have happened, it looks like you had control, or that you can tell the story. And of course, the people who do win out are the ones who tell the stories. It's a very different thing to be looking from here towards the future and presume that one can sort of be in control. It's a very different thing to look from here to the future and understand that you can do A, and the likelihood is what you're trying to make happen is, new sets of conditions of possibility that will make that and that and that happen. But there are all kinds of other things that may happen at the same time. So again, it's very different whether you're looking to the future or looking into the past. To say a little something about the theology of the cross in the Christian tradition, of course that has been, if you like, interpreted I think erroneously, in terms of suffering causes redemption. You know, if you take a transaction kind of approach to the cross, which unfortunately has won the day through most of Christian history, you can see an A that causes a B. You know, Jesus' death on the cross caused our redemption. I think that's quite an erroneous way to understand it and has been very detrimental, particularly to women, because then you end up with a cult of suffering in which, to the degree that we're expected to imitate Jesus, and because, of course, women require more redemption than men because we're more sinful, then, you know, women all the more are supposed to buy into this, well, the more you suffer, the more you'll be redeemed, right? If you look, I think there's a very different way to look at the Christian story in terms of, if you want to call it, an ethic of risk, which is that Jesus made decisions over against very powerful regimes that he was a part of, and that every choice that he made, he was taking certain kind of risks, but he allowed those risks to unfold, and in that case meant the supreme sacrifice. He lost his life. But that out of that risk-taking, that set the conditions of possibility for resurrection to happen. God is a risk-taker, absolutely. Right. So that's a very different way of understanding the incarnation as well, that God allowed Jesus to become human was a big risk. Well, creation itself was a pretty big risk on God's part. But for good or for ill, whatever risks God took, God created a world in which probabilities are at work, and therefore we are subject to risk. I mean, that's simply a fact. Whether you fault God for doing that is a further question. But.
I wonder if you could explain a little why you choose the word risk instead of something else. You could say the ethic of chance or indeterminism or something else, but you seem to like the word risk. Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been asked that before. Initially, it's because I just adopted this these terms, this terminology from Sharon Welch, and that's the language that she had used. It's also catchy, and ethics of probability doesn't quite, sort of grab you on the same. But I think it actually works, because on my sort of theoretical side, when you talk about chance and probabilities, you're talking about the likelihood of something happening. And likelihoods are about risk. Now, risk may be a little loaded in the sense that it sounds like it's dangerous, okay? Whereas I'm not saying that every time we decide to, do this instead of that, we're making a dangerous decision. But simply, it does then reflect that idea of when you roll the dice, you're taking a 1 in 6 chance that, you're going to get a 6. And so there's a certain risk involved in the choices that you make.
It makes it more personal.
I haven't come up with a term that is quite as catchy and seems to grab, but there are downsides to using that term, yeah.
On that note, would you agree then, on the note of risk-taking as being more central in conceptualizing our lives and our purpose and our meanings, would you then think that we should be training young people and each other and our citizens to when we encounter each other, we should be asking them, what risks are you taking, rather than what do you do?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that the notion of control is built right into that question of how much control have you got and how much control have you got and where do you fit in instead of how you're rolling the dice.
Yeah, good comment. And I'll add, I actually gave this lecture last night in Toronto, and a few of these things came up in the discussion, that I don't mean, when I talk about sort of the regularities, the classical laws of science, they interact with probabilities. So it's not, we don't live in two different worlds. It's the same world that, we have certain regularities that occur according to probabilities. So I don't want to give the impression that an ethic of control, that we never make decisions where we're trying to establish control. I mean, control is not a bad thing, right? So even when you're setting up the conditions of probability, for example, what Nicole Pajot was doing in Kibaranko was trying to set the conditions of possibility for regularities to emerge, right? So that they weren't living in isolation, they weren't living in chaos, so that they had routine, even if it's just the routine of going together and doing beadwork in the same room together, okay? So what you're trying to create are regularities. So it's not that risk is always a good thing and that control is always, or regularities are always a bad thing. The other thing about risks, of course, is that one can take risks as long as there are already some established regularities, patterns, schemes of recurrence that allow that risk-taking to take place. So you also have to have the image of boundaries within which so you almost have to set up the conditions of possibility for safe risk-taking, right? So in no way am I advocating sort of, don't worry about boundaries, don't worry about, and that's why actually in Sharon Welch's book she makes a big deal about strategic risk-taking and the fact that you're bounded within community, because you need a community to be telling you when you're taking risks that are dangerous, when you've taken too many, when you need to back off. And so you need to think carefully about the kind of risks you're going to take. I'm aware that oftentimes when I speak, I'm happy to hear from the next person, but that often women and students are reluctant to get up to microphones. And I know there are some students in the room as well, so I would encourage you, if you feel less clout in front of a microphone, that you go ahead and take a risk. So if there are students or others who would like to speak, I'd be happy to hear from you. Yeah.
So I'm concepts of control and risk within those of democracy and the market. And it concerns me that there are those who perhaps malevolently intervene to corrupt these natural feedback and even feed-forward processes. With respect to the election in the States, there's been, of course we see the media being misused. There's a talk of voting machines that really don't work as they should. I mean, these are all part of a control culture that tries to increase the certainty that they will get the result that they want. You see the same thing happening with the marketing process. Media again used. In fact, even subliminal methods used to corrupt again a process so necessary to ensure the survival of corporations, potentially, the survival of our government, of our culture. So that concerns me, that there's this extreme emphasis on control, almost for the sake of control and power, and that these have become values elevated beyond really what they should be, and they should be part of a set of values and ethics, if you like, ethical codes, that we use to guide our lives rather than being something that's way out of proportion and then running wild and potentially threatening our very existence.
Very good comments. A couple things. First of all those machinations are from people who think they're in control, but all they're really doing is shifting probabilities, right? They're trying to set up voting districts or ways of voting, et cetera, that will heighten the probability of their being elected, okay? So in spite of the fact that, you're concerned about all this control, well, there are some real limitations to that control. I mean, again, all those people are doing is fiddling with probabilities. And again, what I'm trying to say here is not so much, there may be times and places where we need to take very, decisive action to try and do everything we can so that when we do A, B follows. what I'm sort of trying to get at here is the story we tell ourselves about what we're doing when we do that. So when you say you see all this control going on, I would ask, is it really control? Are these people really in control? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the bigger question is, do they think they are? This model, this image of model, this model of moral agency is that we think that, well, we're doing A and B is following, whereas really what's happening is a kind of shifting of probabilities.
In more control than we suspect because we don't understand all the methods that are being used. So maybe they've greatly increased the probability they'll get the outcome that they want, much beyond we suspect they've done.
Okay. Yes, over here.
Would you be willing to comment on what the underlying reasons are for the human person to feel more comfortable taking control than taking risks?
Well, it's kind of scary to take risks. I
was hoping to hear that answer because it seems also to me that it's mostly a question of fear.
Yeah, I think it is about fear. And again, I don't want to sort of polarize this too much as if sort of there are big bad people out there that think they're working by an ethic of control, and then there are us good people who know we're taking risks. We all do this, and again, control is a very important thing, right? For example, if you're a patient, it's very, even just like learning how to deal with pain is about control, right? Because you have some control over the pain if you know how to breathe or you understand the medicines you're taking. So control is a good thing, and control comes with knowledge and so on and so forth. But again, it's a question, I suppose, of hubris, of do we think that we are ultimately in control of our destinies? And so again, safety, boundaries, control are all very important to put in place in a variety of situations. But I think we get into trouble when we think that we are then the agents of our own creation or the agents of our own futures. And it's just very scary to understand the ambiguity of some of the choices that we make and to understand that sometimes we make choices that have consequences we're not aware of.
So as a that secondary fear, what's the gift piece?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's your question answers the previous question, I think, is that if we have, and I would answer this from a very religious point of view, if we have a faith that says that we aren't in control of our destiny, but that someone is, again, you can call it God, you can call it the force, you can call it whatever you want, but if we have a stance in life by which instead of trying to pretend we're our own creators, we understand that everything we have is gift, our very existence is gift. That's a very different way of being in the world. And that's also a very different way of dealing with the fear, right? Now, I'm not saying this is easy, right? But that is the difference, is whether you live, and it really is the difference between fear and love. And, the bottom line is you pick, it's one or the other. You either believe, Johann Baptist Metz has a tiny little book called Poverty of the Spirit. And he ends one chapter talking about anxiety, where he says it basically comes down to either we live out of anxiety and do everything from there, trying to then be frantic about, controlling our lives, or we accept our poverty and live in love, So, yeah, it has something to do with accepted life being gifted and trusting in that. Now, that's a big one, right? And it's as big as going to the cross, knowing you're going to die. Okay, there are no simple solutions here. So it could involve tremendous sacrifice. But it's nothing less than the faith that Jesus had, that if he kept being obedient to what he felt he had to do in terms of justice and truth, that somehow God would rest it, that God would do it. Okay, so it's not that Jesus fell asleep and then decided to wake up. He really died, and died not knowing, I think, not knowing what the outcome would be. Yeah.
One of the things that intrigued me about Sharon Welch's book was the emphasis that she put on the experience of Afro-American women in this whole business of risk-taking, and the way she used the womanist literature for that same reason. And I wondered if you would comment more on that and give us an explanation of why you think that is so.
Okay, very good question. Sharon Welch herself is a Caucasian, so she uses these novels not from her own ethnic tradition. But I think she turned to them, saying there's some richness here that I, as a privileged white person, can learn from. And I think it has something to do with what people talk about in terms of double consciousness. That if in some way you're on the underside of history, I don't know how else to call it, but you have a diminished social power for whatever reason, you have to learn two worlds. Okay, you have to learn how the dominant culture functions because it's a matter of your survival, right? But you also learn how you and your family and your particular group function. So you kind of live in a double world. So I think she turned to these just because they illustrated that position of people living in an ethic of risk and making sacrifices, not knowing what the outcome would be. You know, in some of these novels, young girls are making choices and there's no on the horizon, there's no prospect that the prejudice, the bigotry, the danger is going to go away. But it's still possible to claim dignity and claim voice, and to do that in the midst of the failure, the possible failure of the bigger hope to eradicate evil. I'd like to say one other thing, and that's that I've come to most of the lectures that have happened this fall in terms of social justice, and at almost every one of them, someone has gotten up and asked Gregory Baum or James Loney or whoever it is, but we're so discouraged. You know, can't you tell us, what do we do? Yes, I believe everything you're saying about social justice, but what do we do? And I hear sort of underneath that question a kind of angst over, why aren't we fixing anything? You know, this presumption of an ethic of control. And again, I'm not saying it isn't a heartfelt question or it isn't an important question, but again, maybe we should think in terms of probabilities, you know, not how do I fix everything that's wrong in the world, but how do I do this tomorrow in my world that's just going to shift the chances, the likelihood that some other new thing, better thing might unfold. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for challenging us for reconsidering an ethic of risk. I've asked Dr. Christina Vaneen to come forward. She is the chair of religious studies here at St. Jerome's University, as well as the director of the Masters in Catholic Thought program here. So I'd like to invite her forward to give an official thank you.
Making a path by walking. Risk, gratitude, love. In 45 minutes. That's So thank you, Cindy, for this evening making a path for us towards facing the truth of the vulnerability and ambiguity of each of our moral choices and lives. Thank you for taking, I think, an extraordinary risk of walking us through evolution in the middle of a talk on feminist ethics. It's too good. You've reminded us through this that love does indeed require work for justice, as exemplified by Teresa Deese and the Loretto Sisters, by Nicole Pajot. A love that does justice can indeed shift probabilities, that more persons and even the planet itself can perhaps live this fullness of life. As each of us discerns how we can participate in this energy of love that is at work in the universe, you have challenged us to see how much we presume and operate according to our own ethics of control, and that this is just wrong. You invite us to make the commitment instead of walking the pathway of risk, and of walking that in community with others in the hopes of increasing the conditions for justice to emerge in our world. So for all of this, we express our gratitude to you.
Well, I feel like going walking right now. Thank you. Just a few final reminders. Thank you, Christina, for that. Wordsworth Books from Waterloo will be selling copies of Cynthia's book, as well as a number of other books she mentioned here tonight. They have a table set up at the back. Our next lecture here at the center is on the 1st of December. We are hosting the Most Reverend James Weisgerber, Archbishop of Winnipeg, to talk about bridging the gap, reaching beyond our differences. The Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community sells fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea at the back. As well, there are sign-up sheets for the St. Jerome Center mailing list and email list, and you can also purchase tapes and CDs of our lectures for $10. Thank you to Carol Person, who helps every Friday evening here to make the nights go extremely smoothly. Thank you for the Loretto sisters for being here tonight. It's wonderful to have you with us again. Thank you to Cyntia Crysdale for her not only inspirational talk, but to encourage us to put our walking shoes on. And most importantly, thank you to the audience for coming tonight and for supporting the center. It's always wonderful to see you here. For now, I wish you a safe trip home, and until next time, peace.